The Golden Girl became Lot 17, but the price for her life is worth more than gold. In a world where love is treason and mercy is a death sentence, an enemy becomes the only wall between her and the abyss. A sweet, forbidden, and desperate story begins right now. The air in the ministry's underground atrium was thick with the scent of ozone, expensive cologne, and the metallic tang of old blood. It was a suffocating cocktail that clawed at Hermione's throat, making every breath a conscious struggle. She stood on a raised dais, her wrists bound by heavy iron manacles that pulsed with a dull, thrumming anti-magic field. The cold from the metals seeped into her marrow, a constant reminder that the lioness of Gryffindor had been declawed, caged, and brought to market. The great hall of the ministry had been transformed into a macabre theatre. Above, the enchanted ceiling did not show the starry sky or the soft drift of clouds. It was a stagnant, bruised purple reflecting the mood of the new regime. Crystal chandeliers, reclaimed from plundered manor houses, cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the audience below. They were the victors, the elite of the Dark Lord's new world, dressed in silks and dragonhide, their faces masked by a chilling, polite indifference. Hermione kept her gaze fixed on a jagged crack in the floor tiles. If she looked up, she would see the faces of people she once sat across from in the library. If she looked up, she would see the predatory hunger in their eyes. She was no longer a person. She was Lot 17, the last remaining piece of a broken resistance, a trophy to be mounted on a wall. "Do we have an opening bid for the mudblood?" The auctioneer's voice was oily, sliding over the crowd like a slug. He didn't use her name. Names carried humanity, and humanity was a currency no longer accepted in London. A ripple of low laughter vibrated through the room. Hermione tightened her grip on her own fingers, her knuckles turning a ghostly white. The friction of her skin against skin was the only thing keeping her grounded. She felt a phantom itch in her palm, the place where her wand used to rest, a limb lost to a cruel amputation. 50 galleons, a voice croaked from the front row. It was Crabbe Senior, his face bloated with a sadistic sort of glee. 70, countered another. The bidding climbed, a casual exchange of gold for a soul. Hermione felt a wave of nausea roll over her. She was being priced like a rare manuscript or a pedigree owl. Each shout of a number was a hammer blow against the pedestal of her dignity. She closed her eyes, trying to retreat into the mental library she had built during her months in the dungeons. She tried to smell the parchment, the vanilla of old bindings, the dust of the restricted section. But the scent of ozone here was too strong. 1,000 galleons. The room fell into a sudden vacuum-like silence. The chatter died mid-sentence. The scraping of chairs ceased. Even the auctioneer paused, his gavel hovering in the air like a suspended executioner's blade. Hermione's eyelids fluttered open. She couldn't help it. The voice was cold, precise, and carried the weight of an Arctic winter. It was a voice she had heard in hallways for 7 years, a voice that had taunted her, sneered at her, and eventually haunted her. Draco Malfoy stood at the back of the room, leaning against a black marble pillar. He wasn't wearing the ostentatious robes of the other purebloods. He was in charcoal black, tailored so sharply it looked like it could draw blood. His hair, once a shock of platinum, seemed duller, more like tarnished silver under the ministry lights. His face was a mask of aristocratic boredom, but his eyes, grey and piercing as a storm over the North Sea, were fixed directly on her. 1,000, the auctioneer repeated, his voice trembling slightly. Lord Malfoy, that is, a significant sum for a domestic. I find my manor is in need of something particularly resilient, Draco replied. He didn't move. He didn't smile. He looked at Hermione as if she were a piece of furniture he was considering for a guest wing he never intended to use. And I grow tired of the bickering. 1,000, unless anyone here wishes to challenge the Malfoy coffers. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, pressurized, pushing against Hermione's eardrums. She watched him, her breath hitching in her chest. Of all the fates she had imagined, the dungeons of the Lestrange family, the camps in the north, the Vale itself, this felt like the most calculated cruelty. To be owned by the boy who had spent his youth wishing for her non-existence. Going once, going twice. The gavel cracked against the wood. The sound echoed through the atrium like a gunshot. Sold to the House of Malfoy. The manacles on Hermione's wrists were jerked forward by an invisible force, dragging her toward the edge of the stage. She stumbled, her legs weak from weeks of malnutrition, but she refused to fall. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her on her knees. As she was led down the steps, the crowd parted for her as if she were diseased. She was escorted to the back of the hall where Draco waited. As she approached, the atmospheric pressure between them seemed to spike. The air grew thin. He didn't speak. He didn't even acknowledge the guards who handed him the heavy iron key to her magical restraints. He simply reached out and took her arm. The contact was electric. His fingers were cold, the bite of his silver signet ring pressing into her skin through the thin fabric of her tattered tunic. Hermione flinched, a visible tremor running through her shoulders, but his grip remained firm, not bruising, but unbreakable. "Don't," he whispered. It was so low only she could hear it, a breath of frost against her ear. He turned and led her toward the flue chimneys. Hermione walked beside him, her head bowed, her mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. He was walking too fast, his long strides forcing her to hurry to keep up. Every time their shoulders brushed, she felt a jolt of static, a magnetic repulsion that kept her nerves screaming. They stepped into the green flames of the flue, and the world dissolved into a spinning vortex of soot and emerald light. When the spinning stopped, Hermione was spat out onto a cold stone floor. She tumbled forward, her hands catching her fall on a plush, dark rug. She stayed there for a moment, gasping for air, the smell of wood smoke and dried lavender filling her senses. "Stand up, Granger." She looked up. They were in a vast, cavernous drawing room. The walls were lined with dark oak, and the windows stretched from floor to ceiling, looking out onto a landscape of mist and skeletal trees. This was Malfoy Manor, the place where she had been tortured, the place where the floor had tasted her blood. She stood up slowly, her muscles aching. Draco was standing by a sideboard, pouring amber liquid into a crystal glass. He took a long drink, his back to her. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the crackle of a dying fire in the hearth. "Why?" she rasped. Her voice was thin, unused to speaking. Draco turned. He looked at her then, really looked at her. He saw the dirt on her face, the hollows of her cheeks, and the way her hands wouldn't stop shaking. His expression remained unreadable, but the muscle in his jaw turned. "You are a mess," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will be cleaned, you will be fed, and you will stay in the East Wing." "Why did you buy me, Draco?" she asked again, using his name like a weapon. "To finish what Bellatrix started? To watch me break in person?" He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing on the stone. He stopped just inches away, invading her personal space until she was forced to tilt her head back to look him in the eye. The scent of sandalwood and expensive fire whiskey rolled off him. "You think too highly of your own entertainment value," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous silky register. He reached out, his hand hovering near her throat. Hermione froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't strike her. Instead, he reached for the collar of her tunic, his fingers brushing the sensitive skin of her neck. He adjusted the frayed fabric, his touch lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The tactile friction sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. "You are here because I paid for you," he said, his grey eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her want to look away. "And in this house, what I own, no one else touches. Do you understand?" "I am not a thing," she hissed, her Gryffindor pride flickering to life through the exhaustion. "In the eyes of the Ministry, you are less than a thing," he countered. He leaned in closer, his lips almost touching her temple. "In this house, you are a ghost, and if you want to stay a living one, you will do exactly as I say. No questions, no defiance, no golden girl heroics." He pulled back, the sudden loss of his warmth leaving her feeling strangely exposed in the drafty room. He tossed the iron key onto a nearby table. It landed with a heavy, final clatter. "A house elf will show you to your quarters. Do not leave them without my permission. The wards are keyed to my blood. If you try to cross the perimeter, they will strip the skin from your bones." He turned away, dismissing her as if she were indeed the furniture he had joked about. Hermione watched his retreating back, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the hem of her sleeve. She wanted to scream, to throw the crystal decanter at his head, to demand to know where Ron and Harry were. But as she looked around the shadows of the drawing room, she realized she was in a different kind of war now. A war of silence, of shadows, and of the suffocating space between her and the man who had just purchased her life. She was safe from the auction block, but as she followed a trembling house elf out of the room, she felt the heavy weight of the manor closing in on her. She was a prisoner of the boy she hated, in a world that wanted her dead. And for the first time, she wasn't sure which was more dangerous, the Dark Lord's wrath, or the strange flickering light she had seen for a fleeting second in Draco Malfoy's eyes. It hadn't been hatred. It had been something much more terrifying. It had been desperation. The east wing of Malfoy Manor was a cathedral of solitude. It was a place of high vaulted ceilings and tapestries that depicted hunts long finished, where hounds of silver thread chased stags of silk through forests that had faded to the colour of bone. Hermione sat by the window of her room, her fingers tracing the intricate frost patterns on the glass. The house elf, a tiny, trembling creature named Mipsy, had brought her a tub of hot water and a tray of food that tasted of salt and ash in her mouth. She had bathed until her skin was raw, trying to scrub away the scent of the Ministry dungeons. but the cold of the manor seemed to have settled beneath her ribs, a permanent fixture of her new architecture. She was wearing a gown of heavy, dark green velvet, clearly a relic from the Malfoy family archives. It was too long, the hem pooling around her feet like a bruise, and the scent of cedar and ancient magic clung to the fabric. It felt like a shroud. A sharp, rhythmic rap at the door shattered the silence. Hermione didn't answer, but the door groaned open anyway. Draco stood on the threshold. The flickering candlelight from the corridor cast long, distorted shadows behind him, making him look taller, more imposing. He had shed his formal coat, appearing now in a white silk shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The sight was jarring. It was too domestic, too human for the monster she had prepared herself to face. "You haven't eaten," he noted, his voice flat. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the untouched tray on the table. "I'm not a dog to be fed on command," Hermione replied, her voice sounding brittle even to her own ears. She didn't look at him, keeping her eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the yew trees outside. "No," Draco said, his footsteps soft as he crossed the room. "A dog would have the sense to maintain its strength. You, however, seem intent on becoming a martyr for a cause that is currently being erased from the history books." He stopped a few feet away from her. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted, that familiar, oppressive static thickening the air. Hermione finally turned her head, her gaze clashing with his. The grey of his eyes was stormy, turbulent, contradicting the practiced stillness of his face. "Is that why you brought me here? To lecture me on the futility of hope?" she hissed. "Or is this the part where you tell me how grateful I should be that I'm not being sold to the Rolls or the Greybacks?" Draco's expression didn't flicker, but his hand, resting on the back of a chair, tightened. The wood groaned under the pressure. "Grateful? No, Granger. I don't expect gratitude from a creature that bites the hand trying to keep it out of the snare." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass vial. It contained a swirling, pearlescent liquid, dreamless sleep. He set it on the table with a sharp clink. "Drink it. You look like a corpse, and your pacing is keeping the portraits awake." "I don't want your potions," she snapped, standing up. The movement was too fast. Her head swam and she stumbled. Before she could hit the floor, his hand was there. He caught her by the upper arm, his grip firm and searingly hot against her skin. The physical contact felt like an intrusion, a violation of the cold vacuum she had tried to build around herself. She tried to pull away, but he held her fast, his thumb pressing into the soft dip of her inner elbow. "Let go," she breathed, her heart beginning to gallop. "You are so remarkably stubborn," he whispered, and for the first time she heard a crack in the ice of his voice. There was a jagged edge of frustration there, a raw, unpolished emotion that didn't belong in the Malfoy repertoire. "You think this is a game? You think you're still in the common room, arguing over house points?" He jerked her closer, forcing her to look at the hollows under his own eyes. Up close, he didn't look like a victor. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside, a shell held together by nothing but the starch in his collar and the weight of his name. "The Dark Lord is coming here, Hermione," he said, using her name for the first time. It sounded like a confession, a secret whispered in a confessional. "In 3 days, he wants to see his prize. He wants to see that you are broken, And if you look like this, if you look like you're ready to spit in his face, he will take you from me, and I cannot stop him then." The air left Hermione's lungs in a sharp, jagged gasp. The "can't stand it" and "can't help but think" of their dynamic collided in that moment. She hated him for being the one to tell her this, for being the one who held her life in his manicured hands. And yet, the way his fingers trembled against her arm betrayed a terror that mirrored her own. "Why do you care?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is one more mud-blood to you?" Draco's face contorted, a flash of something that looked dangerously like agony crossing his features before he smoothed it back into marble. He released her so abruptly she had to catch herself on the windowsill. "I don't care," he lied, the words falling between them like lead weights. "But I paid 1,000 galleons for you. I dislike losing my investments." He turned on his heel and marched toward the door. "Draco!" she called out, the name catching him like a hook. He paused, his hand on the heavy iron latch. "If he's coming, why keep me in the East Wing? Why give me a room with a view instead of a cell?" He didn't turn around. The candlelight caught the silver of his hair, creating a halo that felt like a mockery. "The cells are full, Granger," he said, his voice returning to that dead, robotic calm. "And I find I prefer my ghosts where I can see them." He slammed the door, and the sound of the lock clicking into place felt like a final sentence. Hermione sank back onto the floor, her fingers curling into the thick pile of the rug. She looked at the vial of dreamless sleep on the table. The internal conflict was a physical ache in her chest. He was a Malfoy. He had stood by while her world burned. He was the enemy. And yet, the heat of his hand on her arm still lingered, a ghostly brand that refused to fade. The next day brought a new kind of tension, a silence that was loud with things unsaid. Draco didn't return to her room, but Mipsy brought her books. They weren't the ministry-approved propaganda she expected. They were ancient texts on arithmancy, complex charm theory, and even a battered copy of Hogwarts, a history. Hermione ran her fingers over the spine of the Hogwarts book. It was a silent message, a piece of her old life offered as a peace offering, or perhaps a taunt. She spent the hours pacing the room, her mind working like a trapped animal. She studied the wards on the window. Draco hadn't been lying. They were woven with blood magic, a shimmering, invisible web that tasted of copper and ozone. That evening, she was summoned to the dining hall. The room was vast, dominated by a table of black mahogany that could seat 50. Draco sat at the head, a single candle burning between them, the flames struggling against the vast shadows of the room. He was reading a scroll, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Sit," he said, not looking up. Hermione sat at the opposite end, the distance between them a physical manifestation of the chasm in their souls. A plate appeared before her, pheasant, roasted root vegetables, and a glass of red wine so dark it looked like blood. "Eat. It's not poisoned." "How would I know?" she challenged, her voice echoing in the empty hall. Draco finally looked up, his grey eyes cold. "If I wanted you dead, Granger, I would have let the auctioneer finish his count. Poison is a waste of a good vintage." They ate in a silence that felt like a stretched wire. Every scrape of a fork against porcelain sounded like a scream. Hermione watched him over the rim of her glass. He ate with mechanical precision, his movements elegant and devoid of joy. This was the life of the victors, a hollow palace, a silent table, and the constant, gnawing presence of a master who could unmake them at any moment. "What happened to them?" she asked suddenly. "Harry! Ron!" Draco's hand froze mid-air. He slowly lowered his wineglass. "Potter is a myth now, a story the Ministry tells to keep the children in line. As for the Weasley..." He paused, his gaze dropping to the table. "He's in the north, a labour camp, for now." The news hit her like a physical blow. Ron was alive, but in a living hell. Harry was gone. The hope that had been a small, flickering flame in her heart sputtered and died, leaving only a cold, hard resolve. "And you just let it happen," she whispered, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "You watched them take your classmates, your peers, and you did nothing but count your gold." Draco stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "You know nothing," he roared, the mask finally shattering. The sheer volume of his voice seemed to make the shadows dance. He was across the room in 3 strides, leaning over the table, his face inches from hers. "You think you're the only one who lost everything? Look at this house. Look at me. I am a prisoner in my own skin, Granger. Every breath I take is a debt I owe to a madman." "Then fight," she screamed back, standing up to face him. "You have power. You have wealth." "I have a name that is a target," he countered, his voice cracking with a raw, visceral desperation. "I have a mother whose life depends on my loyalty. I have a mark on my arm that I can never wash off." He grabbed her hand, his fingers crushing hers, and slammed it down onto the table between them. "You want to know what I do? I buy mudbloods at auctions to keep them from being raped and slaughtered by my friends. I hide gold in accounts that don't exist to fund a rebellion that is already dead. I live a lie every single second of every single day." He was panting, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and bloodshot. The tension between them had reached its breaking point, a magnetic pull that was no longer about hate, but about a shared, agonizing recognition of their own ruin. Hermione looked at his hand on hers, the pale, aristocratic fingers holding her with a grip that was less about control and more about an anchor. For a moment, the enemy disappeared. There was only a broken boy and a broken girl in a world that had forgotten the meaning of mercy. She didn't pull away. She let her fingers relax under his, a tiny, almost imperceptible surrender. "Draco," she whispered. The sound of his name seemed to shock him back into himself. He looked down at their joined hands as if seeing them for the first time. His eyes widened, a flash of pure, unadulterated fear crossing his face. Fear of the warmth, fear of the trust that was trying to take root in the frozen soil of his heart. He yanked his hand back as if he had been burned. "Get out," he rasped, turning his back on her. "Go back to your room. Now." "Draco, wait!" "I said, get out!" he screamed, grabbing a crystal goblet and hurling it against the fireplace. It shattered into 1,000 glittering shards, a shower of artificial stars. Hermione fled. She ran through the cold corridors, her velvet dress heavy and mocking, her heart thundering in her ears. She reached her room and collapsed against the door, the click of the lock sounding like a sob. She had seen it. The rot in the foundation of his soul was not malice, but a grief so profound it had turned into a poison. He had brought her to save her, but in doing so, he had invited his own destruction into the house. And as she lay in the dark, Watching the shadows of the trees claw at the window, she realized with a terrifying clarity that she was no longer just afraid for herself. She was afraid for him. The approach had happened. The warmth had flickered. But as the wind howled around the stone turrets of Malfoy Manor, the cold returned with a vengeance, more biting than before, because now she knew exactly what it was trying to extinguish. The following morning, the manor was shrouded in a mist so thick it felt as though the world beyond the gates had simply ceased to exist. Hermione stood by the fireplace in her room, watching the flames lick at the logs. The heat was superficial. It couldn't touch the hollow chill that had settled in her chest after the previous night's explosion. She expected Draco to avoid her, to retreat further behind the walls of his icy indifference. Instead, the door to her chambers was opened not by Mipsy, but by Draco himself. He looked as though he hadn't slept at all. His shirt was rumpled at the collar, and the silver-blonde hair was dishevelled, as if he had spent the night running his hands through it in a fit of restlessness. "Come with me," he said. There was no "please," but the sharp edge of his voice had been blunted into something weary, almost hollow. "Where?" "The library. If I am to present you as a functioning member of this household, you need to look less like a prisoner and more like an assistant. You will help me catalogue the new acquisitions from the Ministry's seizures." Hermione felt a flash of visceral disgust. "You want me to help you sort through the stolen lives of my friends?" Draco stopped in the doorway, his back stiffening. He didn't turn around. "I want you to be in a room where I can protect you, Granger. The library has independent wards. Not even my mother can enter without my leave. Now move. I don't have the patience for your moral grandstanding today." The Malfoy library was a labyrinth of shadows and leather. The scent of ancient magic was so potent here, it made the air feel heavy, vibrating with the echoes of centuries of spells. Tables were piled high with scrolls, artifacts, and books bound in dark, unidentified hides. "Start with the crates on the left," Draco commanded, sitting at a massive desk covered in maps of the European wizarding borders. "Record the titles, the enchantments detected, and the previous owners. Do not, under any circumstances, touch anything with a black seal." They worked in a silence that was less of a void and more of a bridge. For hours, the only sounds were the scratching of quills and the occasional snap of a log in the hearth. Hermione found herself falling into a rhythm. It was a cruel irony. She was back among books, her natural element, but the circumstances were a nightmare. As she pulled a thin, silver-bound volume from a crate, her breath hitched. It was a diary, the initials LL embossed on the cover in fading gold. Luna. A sharp, stinging heat rose behind her eyes. She traced the letters with her thumb, the tactile friction of the leather, a painful connection to a friend she might never see again. The static in the room suddenly intensified. She didn't have to look up to know Draco was watching her. "She's alive," he said softly. Hermione's head snapped up. Draco was leaning back in his chair, his quill held loosely between his fingers. The candlelight caught the sharp angles of his face, softening the harshness of his mouth. "How do you know?" she whispered, her voice thick with suppressed emotion. "Because I moved her. She was supposed to go to the camps in the north, but I redirected the transport to a holding facility in France. It's..." under the jurisdiction of a branch of the family that hasn't quite lost their minds yet. Hermione let out a breath she felt she had been holding since the auction. The relief was so overwhelming she had to steady herself against the table. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you were looking at that book like you were about to set the library on fire," he said, though there was no malice in the observation. He stood up and walked toward her, his movements fluid and predatory, yet cautious. He stopped at the other side of the crate. "And because I am tired, Granger. I am so damn tired of being the only person in this house who remembers what it's like to be human." He reached out, his hand hovering over the diary. For a moment, she thought he might take it away. Instead, his fingers brushed against hers, a brief, accidental contact that felt like a spark of white light in the dim room. Hermione didn't pull away this time. She watched his hand, the way the knuckles were scarred with fine white lines, remnants of the war she had only seen from the other side. "You're helping them," she realized, the words a soft epiphany. "The rebellion. You're the one the Order whispered about. The Silver Fox." Draco's eyes darkened, and he stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. The proximity was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. She could see the fine texture of his skin, the slight tremor in his lashes. "Don't ever say that name," he hissed, but his voice lacked conviction. It was the plea of a man who was terrified of his own hope. "Names get people killed. Names are a luxury we don't have." He reached out and tucked a stray wild curl behind her ear. The gesture was so unexpectedly intimate, so gentle, that Hermione felt her defenses crumble. It wasn't a master touching a slave. It was a drowning man reaching for a life raft. His fingers lingered on her temple, the warmth of his skin a stark contrast to the cold stone of the manor. "You're a fool, Draco Malfoy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," he breathed. The tension between them shifted from atmospheric pressure to a magnetic pull so strong it was almost physical. In the silence of the library, the world felt very small. Just the two of them, the scent of old paper and the weight of 1,000 secrets. But then, the heavy doors of the library vibrated with a dull thud. A cold, oily sensation crawled up Hermione's spine. The wards were being tested. Draco jumped back, his face instantly reverting to a mask of porcelain indifference. He grabbed a scroll from the table and shoved it toward her. "Right!" he commanded, his voice loud and harsh. The doors swung open. Narcissa Malfoy stood there, her face a frozen map of aristocratic grief and pride. She looked at Hermione as if she were a particularly unpleasant stain on the rug, but her eyes were fixed on her son. "Draco," she said, her voice like a chime. "The Dark Lord's vanguard has arrived. They are in the entrance hall. He expects a report on the acquisition before dinner." The warmth that had begun to thaw the room was instantly replaced by an Arctic blast. Draco didn't look at Hermione. He straightened his cuffs, his movements precise and mechanical. "Of course, Mother. I was just ensuring the girl knows her place in the archives. She is remarkably slow, but her penmanship is adequate." The betrayal was swift and sharp. Hermione felt the familiar sting of rejection, the repulsion phase of their cycle hitting her like a physical blow. She watched him walk toward his mother, his posture perfect, his expression devoid of the vulnerability he had shown just moments before. "Wait," Narcissa said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Hermione's dress. "Is that the black family velvet? Why is she wearing our history, Draco?" Draco didn't miss a beat. "The rags she arrived in were a health hazard, Mother. I didn't want her infecting the rugs. It was the only thing in the East Wing that was functional." He ushered his mother out, the heavy doors closing with a definitive, echoing bang. Hermione was left alone in the silence. She looked down at the diary in her hand. The trust she had felt blooming was now tangled with a bitter, jagged doubt. Was he saving her, or was he just playing a much more complex game? Was she a partner in a secret war, or just a pawn he enjoyed moving across the board? The emotional seesaw swung back toward the cold. That evening, the manor was no longer a silent tomb. It was a buzzing hive of nightmares. The laughter of Smirtages echoed through the corridors, harsh, jagged sounds that made Hermione's skin crawl. She was confined to her room, the door locked from the outside. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting long, skeletal shadows across her bed. She listened to the distant sounds of a feast she was never meant to attend, imagining the faces of the people who had destroyed her world sitting at Draco's table. Suddenly, the lock clicked. She expected Mipsy with a tray. Instead, Draco stumbled in. He was disheveled, his shirt stained with wine, and his eyes were glazed with a mixture of fire whiskey and pure, unadulterated rage. He slammed the door and leaned against it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "They wanted to see you," he rasped. "Avery, Rowell. They wanted me to bring you down so they could test your spirit." Hermione stood up, her heart hammering. "And what did you tell them, Lord Malfoy?" "I told them you were mine," he shouted, the sound echoing in the small room. He crossed the space between them in a blur, grabbing her by the shoulders. His grip was bruising now, the restraint he had shown in the library gone. "I told them I hadn't finished breaking you yet. I told them you were too valuable to be shared." "You pig," she spat, struggling against him. "You're no better than them. You just want the monopoly on the misery." "Is that what you think?" he hissed, pulling her so close their chests were pressed together. She could feel the frantic, irregular thud of his heart. "You think I enjoyed sitting there, listening to them talk about what they do to your skin? You think I liked laughing at their jokes while I wanted to slit their throats?" He shook her, his eyes wild. "I am protecting you, damn you. And you make it so hard. You look at me with those eyes full of judgment and fire, and you make me want to burn this whole world down just to see you smile once." The tension was no longer a metaphor. It was a live wire between them, sparking with anger, lust, and a desperate shared grief. Hermione stopped struggling. She looked into his eyes and saw the broken boy behind the grey storm. "Then burn it," she whispered. "Stop playing their game, Draco. Stop lying to yourself." His gaze dropped to her lips. The air in the room seemed to vanish. The silence was so heavy, it felt like a physical weight. For a heartbeat, she thought he might finally bridge the gap, that he might give in to the approach that had been building since the moment he bought her. But then he saw the faint bruise on her arm where he was holding her. He flinched, his eyes filling with a sudden, sharp clarity. He released her as if she were made of white-hot iron. "I can't," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm already dead, Hermione. Don't let me take you with me." He turned and fled the room, the lock clicking back into place with a sound like a guillotine. Hermione sank to her knees, the cold returning 10 times stronger than before. She touched her shoulder where his hand had been, the tactile friction of his touch still burning her skin. She realized then that the most dangerous thing in Malfoy Manor wasn't the Dark Lord or the Death Eaters. It was the way her heart beat faster when the monster in the room was the only one trying to save her soul. The betrayal of her own feelings was the one thing she hadn't prepared for, and as the night deepened, she knew the next swing of the seesaw might be the one that finally broke them both. The morning after the feast brought a silence so profound it felt as though the manor itself was holding its breath. The mist had not lifted. It had merely thickened, pressing against the window panes like a damp shroud. Hermione sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers curled into the heavy green velvet of her skirts. The ghost of Draco's grip still lingered on her shoulders, a phantom weight that felt both like a brand and a shield. She was caught in a cycle of emotional whiplash. Every time he showed her a sliver of humanity, a mention of Luna, a gentle touch in the library, he followed it with a jagged act of withdrawal. It was a tactical retreat, she told herself. He was a Malfoy. He was trained from birth to pivot between masks. But the raw desperation she'd seen in his eyes last night hadn't been a mask. It had been a confession. The door to her chamber opened with a sharp, clinical click. It wasn't Draco. It was Narcissa. The lady of the manor moved with a grace that felt predatory, her silver blonde hair pinned back so tightly it seemed to pull the skin of her temples. She didn't enter the room so much as she colonized it. Her eyes, a paler shade of grey than her son's, swept over Hermione with a cold, analytical detachment. "My son has a flair for the dramatic," Narcissa said, her voice like the chime of a crystal glass. "Purchasing you was a public spectacle. Keeping you here is a private liability." Hermione stood, her spine stiffening. She refused to be intimidated by the woman who had watched her bleed on the floor of the drawing room years ago. "He bought me to save me, Narcissa, whether you want to admit it or not." Narcissa's lip curled in a microscopic sneer. "He bought you because he is plagued by a conscience he cannot afford. He thinks he is a savior. In reality, he's a man standing on a collapsing bridge, trying to catch a falling star. Both will inevitably end up in the abyss." She stepped closer, the scent of expensive roses and something metallic, perhaps the smell of the manor's ancient wards, surrounding her. "The Dark Lord is not satisfied with Draco's cataloguing of the girl. He wants proof of your utility. If you cannot be broken into a servant, you will be used as a vessel for the younger recruits to practice their legitimacy. Do you understand the agony of a mind being torn open by an amateur, Miss Granger?" Hermione felt a cold shiver of dread. She knew exactly what it meant. It was a death of the self, a systematic erasing of everything she was. "Draco won't let that happen," Hermione said, though the words felt fragile. "Draco," Narcissa whispered, leaning in, "is currently in the south drawing room, being forced to watch the execution of a ministry clerk who was found with a Muggle-born's photograph. He is learning, as he must, that his personal feelings are irrelevant. If you want to survive, and if you want him to survive, you will stop being a woman and start being a tool." With a flick of her wand, Narcissa conjured a stack of coarse grey fabric. "Wear this. The velvet is for Malfoys. This is for what you are." The transformation was immediate. The grey tunic was rough against Hermione's skin, the fibres biting into her like tiny needles. It was the uniform of the erased. When she looked in the mirror, the golden girl was gone, replaced by a shadow with hollow eyes and a name that was no longer spoken. Hours later, Draco returned. He didn't knock. He burst into the room, his face ashen, his hands shaking so violently he had to shove them into his pockets. He saw her in the grey tunic and stopped dead. The atmospheric pressure in the room plummeted. "Who did this?" he rasped. "Your mother," Hermione replied, her voice flat. "She said I needed to look the part, for the vanguard downstairs." Draco took a step toward her, his eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to consume the oxygen in the room. He reached out as if to tear the coarse fabric from her body, but his hand stopped mid-air, trembling. The approach was there, the magnetic pull that wanted to draw them together in a shared scream of defiance. But the repulsion of his reality held him back. "I can't look at you like this," he whispered. "It looks like the cells. It looks like what they want you to be." "Then change it, Draco," she cried out, her own frustration boiling over. "If you're the master of this house, stop letting them dictate the rules. Stop being a spectator to your own life." He laughed then, a harsh, jagged sound that contained no mirth. "You think I have a choice? Every time I look at you, I see the choice I didn't make. I see the world I let die. And every time I try to fix a single brick, the whole wall threatens to crush my mother." He moved closer, invading her space until she was pressed back against the cold stone of the wall. He placed his hands on either side of her head, caging her. The scent of rain and bitter almonds clung to him. The tactile friction of his presence was overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, a desperate living energy in a house of the dead. "I have to take you downstairs," he whispered, his forehead leaning against hers. His voice was a broken thread of sound. "They're waiting. They want to see the unbreakable Granger perform a basic cleaning spell on the floor they've just stained. It's a humiliation, Hermione. It's a ritual." "I won't do it," she breathed, though her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "You will," he said, and for the first time she felt his lips brush against her temple. It wasn't a kiss, it was a desperate anchor. "Because if you don't, I cannot keep you in the East Wing. If you don't, you go to the dungeons, and I cannot reach you there." The warmth of his breath against her skin was a betrayal of her logic. She should hate him for asking this. She should spit in his face for his cowardice. But as she looked into the grey storm of his eyes, she saw the internal guilt that was eating him alive. He wasn't asking her to submit to the Dark Lord. He was asking her to help him keep her alive. "Promise me," she whispered, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She could feel his heart, thudding, irregular, terrified. "Promise me that one day you'll stop watching." Draco didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he gripped her hand, his fingers crushing hers in a silent, agonizing vow. The descent to the great hall was a walk through a nightmare. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat and the sour tang of cheap ale. Men in dark robes lounged on the heirlooms of centuries, their laughter echoing like the croaking of crows. "Ah, the guest of honor!" Roll shouted, his face flushed with drink. The great Hermione Granger, reduced to a scullery maid. It's a poetic justice, wouldn't you say, Malfoy? Draco's grip on her arm tightened, his silver ring biting into her flesh. She is a tool, Raoul, nothing more. Her intellect was always her only value, and that is easily redirected. Hermione was forced to her knees. The floor was cold, the stone biting into her shins. A bucket of water was kicked toward her, sloshing over her hands. She looked up and saw Draco standing beside the Dark Lord's empty chair, his face a perfect, expressionless mask of porcelain. He didn't look at her. He looked over her, his eyes fixed on some distant point on the far wall. The cold was absolute. For an hour, she was subjected to their taunts. She scrubbed the stone until her knuckles bled, her ears ringing with the sounds of their cruelty. Every time she looked up, hoping for a sign, a flicker of the boy from the library, she found only the Lord of the Manor. The betrayal felt fresh, a jagged blade in her heart. He was letting them do this. He was standing there, silent, while they stripped away the last of her pride. But then, as the wine flowed faster and the attention shifted to a new cruelty, she felt a sudden, sharp pressure against the back of her mind. "Don't look at me," the voice whispered, his voice echoing in the halls of her consciousness. "Keep your head down. Look at the water in the bucket." Hermione froze. Legilimency. He was inside her head. She looked down at the murky water. In the reflection, she saw Draco's hand resting on the table. His fingers were moving in a rhythmic pattern, tapping a code she recognized from the Order's old cipher. Tonight, midnight, the library. The wards are weakest at the change of the guard. The realization hit her like a physical shock. He wasn't just watching, he was orchestrating. The humiliation was a cover, a way to make the others lose interest, to make her seem broken and therefore harmless. When the ordeal was finally over, Draco led her back upstairs. He didn't speak until they were inside her room. He slammed the door and locked it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I hate you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I hate that you made me do that." "I know," he said, his voice a dead weight. He didn't try to touch her. The repulsion was at its peak. "I hate myself more than you ever could, Granger. But you're alive. And that's the only currency I have left to trade." He turned to leave, but she caught his sleeve. "The library? Midnight? Why?" Draco looked back at her, and for a split second the mask slipped. Beneath the porcelain was a raw, bleeding wound of a man. "Because," he whispered, "I found a way to get you out. And because if I don't touch you soon, I think I might actually shatter." He left before she could respond, the silence of the room returning like a heavy tide. Hermione sat in the dark, the internal monologue of her mind, a chaotic storm of fear and a burgeoning, terrifying hope. She looked at her bleeding knuckles and then at the door. The seesaw had swung again, from the freezing cold of the hall to the searing heat of his secret vow. She realized then that their relationship wasn't built on trust or even love yet. It was built on the terrifying magnetic friction of two people who were the only ones left in a dying world who knew each other's true names. And as the clock struck 11, she knew that whatever happened in the library would change the atmospheric pressure of their lives forever. There was no going back to being enemies. There was only the magnetic pull of the abyss and the desperate hope that they might find a way to fly before they hit the bottom. The manor at midnight was a different beast altogether. The shadows grew teeth, and the silence was no longer empty. It was a pressurized weight that hummed with the latent power of ancient, sleeping curses. Hermione moved through the east wing like a wraith, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. She had discarded the rough grey tunic, choosing instead a simple black shift she had found at the bottom of a wardrobe. Something less conspicuous, something that didn't feel like a brand. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a thunderclap in the hollow corridors. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a rhythmic reminder of her own mortality. She reached the library doors, her fingers trembling as she touched the heavy oak. The wards didn't bite. They parted like smoke, a cool mist that recognized the residue of Draco's magic on her skin. He was there, standing by the large bay window. He wasn't looking at the books. He was looking at the moon, which hung in the sky like a pale, lidless eye. He hadn't heard her enter, or perhaps he was simply too deep in his own internal wreckage to notice. The atmospheric pressure in the room was suffocating, thick with the scent of old parchment and the sharp, metallic tang of his unspoken fear. "You came," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't turn around. "You told me to," Hermione replied, her voice sounding small in the vast cathedral of knowledge. She walked toward him, the distance between them shrinking with every cautious step. "You said there was a way out." Draco turned then. The moonlight carved his features out of silver and flint. He looked ancient, his youth burned away by the friction of his double life. On the desk behind him lay a single shimmering object, a portkey in the shape of a tarnished silver bird, and beside it a small leather pouch. "A passage to the coast," he explained, his words rapid and low. "From there, a boat to the neutral waters near Denmark. My family has property there that the Dark Lord doesn't know about. It's unplottable. You'll be safe." Hermione looked at the bird, then back at him. The approach was inevitable now, a magnetic pull that she could no longer fight. "And you? What happens when they find the prize is missing from her cage?" Draco's mouth twisted into a ghost of a smirk, a jagged, painful thing. "I'll tell them you overpowered me, that you used some archaic mudblood trick to bypass the wards. They'll punish me, but they won't kill me. I'm too useful as a figurehead." "You're lying," she whispered, stepping into his personal space. The tactile friction of their proximity was electric. She could feel the cold radiating from his clothes, clashing with the feverish heat of his skin. "They'll kill you, Draco. Or worse. You can't stay here." "I have to," he hissed, his eyes wide and wild. "My mother is still here. If I go, she pays the price for my cowardice. I've spent my whole life being a coward, Hermione. Let me do this one thing. Let me be the reason you live." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, before he finally closed the gap. His thumb brushed against her cheek, the skin-on-skin contact sending a jolt of pure, unadulterated sensation through her. It was the warmth she had been starving for, a flicker of light in a world of grey. But as soon as she leaned into it, he pulled back, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the desk. "Don't," he rasped. "Don't make me want to follow you. If I want to live, I can't love you. I can't even like you." The betrayal of his words stung, but she saw the lie in the way his gaze dropped to her mouth. The emotional seesaw was swinging violently now, trust and doubt, warmth and cold clashing in the narrow space between them. "Is that what this is?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and a burgeoning, terrifying affection. "A transaction? You buy my life with yours, and we call it even?" "It's the only deal I can make," he roared softly, the sound muffled by the heavy drapes. He grabbed her by the arms, his grip bruising. "I am a Malfoy. We don't get happy endings. We get survival. We get the quiet rot of our souls in exchange for the safety of our blood. Why can't you just take the win and go?" "Because I won't leave you to them," she screamed back, her hands clenching the front of his shirt. "You think you're the only one who can be a martyr. I've lost Harry. I've lost Ron. I will not lose the only person who still looks at me like I'm a human being." The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. The tension had reached its breaking point. Draco's eyes searched hers, looking for a way out, looking for the hate that should have been there. But all he found was the emotional vulnerability of a girl who had seen the broken boy behind the monster and decided he was worth saving. He groaned, a sound of pure, visceral defeat, and pulled her into him. It wasn't a kiss. Not yet. It was a collision. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot and ragged against her skin. Hermione wrapped her arms around him, her fingers tangling in the silk of his hair. She felt his heart hammering against her chest, a frantic, irregular rhythm that mirrored her own. For a moment, the internal guilt and the broken prejudices vanished. There were no blood statuses, no wars, no manner. There was only the friction of two bodies holding onto each other in the dark, trying to prove they were still alive. "I can't let you stay," he whispered into her skin, his voice breaking. "Hermione, please, if you stay, I'll break. I'll give them everything they want just to keep you from hurting." "Then we both go," she said, pulling back just enough to look him in the eye. "We find a way to get Narcissa out. We don't do this separately." Draco shook his head, a tear finally escaping and tracing a shimmering path down his pale cheek. "The wards, they're tied to her life. If she leaves without his permission, the mark... It's a suicide pact, Hermione. He designed it that way, to keep the old families in line." The cold returned, more biting than before. The realization of the trap they were in settled over them like a layer of ash. Draco let his hands fall from her, the repulsion of his own helplessness forcing him to create distance. "Go," he said, his voice flat and dead. "The port key activates in 10 minutes. If you're still here, I'll hand you over to the Carrows myself. I swear it." "You wouldn't," she breathed. "Try me," he challenged, the mask of the arrogant pureblood sliding back into place, though it was cracked and leaking pain. "I've done worse for less." Hermione looked at him, her heart breaking in a way she hadn't known was possible. The seesaw had swung to the darkest edge. She saw the restraint he was forcing upon himself, the way he was trying to kill the light in his eyes to save her. She walked to the desk and picked up the silver bird. It felt heavy, a cold weight in her palm. "I'll go," she said, her voice steady despite the tears blurring her vision. "But I'm not going to Denmark. I'm going to the coast, and I'm going to wait. For 3 days, Draco. Every night at midnight, I'll be on the cliffs of Dover. If you don't come, I'll come back for you." Draco let out a jagged laugh. "You're a mad woman, Granger." "And you're a Malfoy," she countered, stepping toward him one last time. She reached up and pressed a hand to his cheek. His skin was like ice, but beneath it she felt the frantic pulse of his life. You always find a way to get what you want. Find a way to want to live. She didn't wait for his answer. She turned and ran toward the shadows of the library entrance, the silver bird clutched to her chest. "Hermione!" She stopped, her hand on the door. Draco was standing in the center of the room, the moonlight making him look like a statue. "The cellar," he whispered. "The third wine rack from the left. There's a passage that leads beyond the anti-apparition wards. Don't use the main gates." "Thank you," she breathed. "Don't thank me," he said, turning back to the window. "Just survive, so I can hate myself in peace." Hermione fled into the dark. The internal monologue of her journey through the manor was a blur of fear and determination. She found the passage, the smell of damp earth and rot filling her lungs as she crawled through the narrow tunnel. When she finally emerged into the cold night air, the manor loomed behind her like a jagged tooth against the sky. She gripped the portkey. 5, 4, 3. The world spun. The magnetic pull of the portkey jerked her behind the navel, and for a moment she was nothing but a streak of light in the darkness. When she landed, the air was salt-thick and screaming with the sound of the sea. She was on a cliffside, the white chalk beneath her feet glowing in the moonlight. She was out. She was free. But as she looked back toward the east, where the shadows of the manor lay hidden in the mist, the warmth of his touch seemed to haunt her skin. She was free, but her heart was still a prisoner in a house of stone, locked in a room with a boy who had sold his soul to buy her a chance to breathe. She sat on the edge of the cliff, the wind whipping her hair into a wild frenzy. The seesaw hadn't stopped. It had just moved to a larger stage. And as she looked at the silver bird in her hand, she knew that the next 3 days would be the longest of her life. She would wait for the approach. She would wait for the warmth. Because if Draco Malfoy didn't come for her, she would realize that the betrayal of leaving him behind was a weight she could never carry. The silence of the cliffs was deafening, a hollow echo of the library they had left behind. And in that silence, Hermione Granger finally admitted the one thing that scared her more than the Dark Lord. She was in love with the enemy, and the enemy was currently dying for her. The cliffs of Dover were a desolate, liminal space where the edge of the world met a churning, indifferent sea. For 48 hours, Hermione had been a shadow among the rocks, huddled in a small cave that smelled of brine and damp earth. She had used the last of her strength to cast a series of concealment charms, shoddy, desperate things that flickered like dying candles. Every time the wind howled through the chalk fissures, she heard his voice. Every time the salt spray hit her face, she felt the cold bite of his silver ring. The internal monologue that had sustained her during her imprisonment was now a frantic loop of "can't help but think." She saw his face in the spray, the way his jaw had tightened when he lied to his mother, the way his eyes had fractured when he told her he was already dead. The seesaw of her emotions was no longer about his actions, but about her own sanity. Had she left him to a butcher? Was her freedom worth the hollow silence where his heartbeat should be? On the third night, the moon was swallowed by a bank of heavy, bruise-colored clouds. The air turned electric, the scent of ozone, that familiar scent of the ministry and the manor, thickening until it tasted like copper on her tongue. Hermione stood on the precipice, her fingers digging into the rough wool of the cloak she had stolen from a clothesline in a nearby village. Midnight. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic thud of the waves against the base of the cliffs. She waited, her eyes straining against the dark. 1 minute passed. 5, 10. The cold began to seep into her bones, not just from the wind, but from the dawning realization that he wasn't coming. The betrayal she felt wasn't directed at him, but at the hope she had allowed to take root. She was a fool. She was a Gryffindor who had mistaken a tactical retreat for a grand romance. Suddenly, a crack, like a whip breaking the sound barrier, echoed across the plateau. Hermione's wand, a piece of driftwood she had tried to imbue with her intent, a useless stick, was out in an instant. A figure slumped onto the grass 100 yards away. It wasn't a graceful landing. The figure rolled, limbs tangling before coming to a rest face down in the dirt. "Draco," she breathed, her voice lost to the wind. She ran. The distance felt like miles, her breath hitching in her chest as she stumbled over the uneven ground. As she reached him, the atmospheric pressure changed. The air around him was warped, shimmering with a residue of violent magic. She dropped to her knees, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch, afraid of what she would find. He was wearing his black suit, but it was shredded, the fine silk soaked with something dark and viscous. "Draco! Draco! Look at me!" She rolled him over. His face was a mask of blood and soot, his skin so pale it was almost translucent in the dark. His eyes were closed, his lashes matted with red. But it was his left arm that made her stomach turn. The sleeve was gone, and the dark mark was pulsing with a sickly, necrotizing violet light. "Hermione!" His voice was a wet rattle, a sound of absolute exhaustion. "I'm here. I'm here, you idiot," she sobbed, finally pulling him into her lap. The tactile friction was no longer about sparks or tension. It was about the visceral reality of his dying warmth. She pressed her hands to his chest, feeling the shallow, erratic flutter of his heart. He opened his eyes. The grey was clouded, the pupils blown wide with pain, but as they focused on her, a flicker of that old, arrogant light returned. You stayed," he rasped, his hand coming up to weakly grip her wrist. His fingers were slick with blood. "Told you, you were a madwoman." "Hush. Don't talk. I have to heal you," she said, her mind racing through the few medical spells she could perform without a wand. "Can't," he whispered, his grip tightening with a sudden, desperate strength. "The mark. He knows. When I triggered the port key for my mother, he felt it. He's coming, Hermione. He's following the trail." The warmth of his return was instantly iced over by terror. "Your mother? Where is she?" "Safe. Denmark. I used the Malfoy vault blood rite. Swapped my life for hers in the wards." He let out a jagged, rattling laugh that turned into a cough. "Poetic, isn't it? The heir, finally useful for something other than a trophy." The internal guilt he had carried was gone, replaced by a terrifying hollow peace. He had done it. He had broken the seesaw by throwing himself off it. "We have to move," she said, her voice rising in panic. She tried to lift him, but he was a dead weight. The repulsion of her own helplessness felt like a physical blow. "No," Draco said, his eyes fixing on hers with an intensity that stopped her breath. Listen to me. The silver bird, it has a second charge. It was never meant for me. It was meant to take you further, to France, to the resistance. I am not leaving you here to die on a cliffside, she screamed, the sound lost to the crashing waves. Look at me, he roared, though the sound was more of a wheeze. He dragged her down until their faces were inches apart. The scent of copper and burnt magic was overwhelming. I am already dead, Hermione. The mark is eating the magic out of my blood. But you are the only thing in this world that still makes sense. If you die, then I died for nothing. Do you understand? Don't make my death a waste. The tension between them had reached its final agonizing peak. It was no longer about enemies to lovers. It was about the devastating price of a soul. Hermione looked at him, the boy who had called her names, the man who had bought her life, the hero who had never wanted to be one. I won't let you, she whispered. She leaned down and pressed her lips to his. It wasn't the kiss of a romance novel. It was desperate, salty, and tasted of iron. It was a collision of two shattered lives. She poured every ounce of her magic, every bit of her Gryffindor fire, into the contact. She felt his body shudder, his breath hitching against her mouth. For a heartbeat, the magnetic pull was so strong, it felt as though their souls were trying to knit together, to fill the gaps where the war had torn them apart. Draco's hand tangled in her hair, his touch frantic, returning the kiss with a hunger that spoke of years of suppressed longing. In the dark, on the edge of the abyss, they were no longer a Malfoy and a Granger. They were just two people, finally, briefly, whole. He pulled back, gasping for air. Go, he whispered, his forehead against hers. Please, Hermione, go. No, she said, her voice suddenly calm, hardened by a resolve that had been forged in the Manor's shadows. She reached into her cloak and pulled out the silver bird. We go together, or we stay together. It won't carry two, he argued, his voice fading. It will if we share the same heartbeat, she said, a wild arithmancy-based theory forming in her mind. It was madness. It was impossible. It was exactly what Hermione Granger was best at. She wrapped her arms around him, pinning his bleeding body to hers, her heart beating against his. She jammed the silver bird between their chests, the metal biting into their skin. Close your eyes, Draco, she whispered into his ear. Why? Because I'm about to do something very Gryffindor. She didn't wait for the portkey to activate on its own. She bit her lip until it bled and pressed her bloody mouth to the silver bird, invoking the ancient blood magic he had taught her by accident in the library. Blood to blood, soul to soul. The world didn't just spin, it shattered. The violet light of the mark clashed with the silver glow of the bird. The atmospheric pressure reached a point where Hermione felt her bones might liquefy. She heard a scream, not hers, not Draco's, but the high, cold scream of the Dark Lord reaching the cliffside just as they vanished. The sensation of travel was 1,000 needles. She felt Draco's grip on her hair loosen, felt his body go limp, but she refused to let go. She held him until her fingers cramped, until the darkness swallowed the sound of the sea. When the world returned, it was silent. The air was warm, smelling of lavender and wild thyme. There was no salt, no ozone, no screams. Hermione fell onto a soft, grassy slope, the weight of Draco crushing her. She gasped for air, her lungs burning. Draco! She pushed him off her slightly, her hands shaking as she searched for a pulse. He lay still. The violet light in his arm had faded, leaving behind a scarred, blackened ruin, but the necrotizing glow was gone. The port key had stripped the magic out, the curse and the life force both. "Draco, wake up! Wake up, you arrogant, beautiful prat!" She shook him, her tears falling onto his bloody face, washing away the soot. She pressed her ear to his chest. Thump, thump. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief broke from her throat. It was weak, it was fragile, but it was there. She looked around. They were in a valley, the sun beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. This wasn't Denmark. This wasn't the coast. It was somewhere peaceful, somewhere the war hadn't reached yet. Hermione sat back, pulling his head into her lap once more. She smoothed his hair, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. The seesaw had finally stopped. The approach had been made, the trust had been tested in the fire, and the warmth, cold as it had been, had finally won. Draco's eyes fluttered open. He looked up at the golden sky, then at her. He reached up, his fingers, now clean of the violet curse, brushing a stray curl from her face. "Are we dead?" he whispered. "No," she said, a watery smile breaking across her face. "We're just beginning." He looked at his arm, then back at her, a slow, real realization dawning in his eyes. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say I love you. He didn't have to. The non-verbal intimacy of the moment said it all. He reached up, his hand cupping the back of her neck, and pulled her down for a second kiss. This one wasn't about blood or iron. It was slow, emotional, and tasted of the sunrise. It was the final shift they had both been terrified of. As the light filled the valley, Hermione realized that the auction had been the end of her life as a victim. But this broken, beautiful mess of a man in her arms was the beginning of her life as a person who chose her own destiny. The Golden Girl and the Death Eater were gone. There was only Hermione and Draco, two ghosts who had decided to haunt the world together, and for the first time in her life, the silence wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The valley was a sanctuary of emerald and gold, a pocket of the world that felt as though it had been forgotten by the encroaching shadow of the Dark Lord. For 2 days, the only sounds were the rustle of the wind through the olive trees and the rhythmic, steady breathing of a man returning from the threshold of the void. They had landed on the outskirts of a small, secluded estate in the south of France, a property so old and so deeply buried in Malfoy history that it had remained untouched by the current ministry's grasp. Hermione sat on the stone terrace, the warmth of the Provençal sun soaking into her skin, a sensation so foreign it felt like an intrusion. She was watching Draco. He was sitting on a low stone wall at the edge of the vineyard, staring out at the horizon. He was wearing a soft linen shirt she had found in the house, the sleeves rolled up to hide the blackened, scarred tissue where the dark mark had once burned with a sentient malice. The atmospheric pressure between them had changed. It was no longer the crushing weight of the manor or the frantic terror of the cliffs. It was a fragile, crystalline stillness. The seesaw had stilled at the center, but the balance was precarious. Draco had barely spoken since they arrived. He ate what she gave him. He slept in fits and starts, and he watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. It was the can't help but think stage of their recovery. the realization that they had survived the impossible and now had to face the reality of who they were to each other without a war to define them. "The silence is loud today," she said, stepping onto the grass. Her voice was soft, hesitant to break the peace. Draco didn't turn around. "I'm listening for the sound of wings, or fire. I keep expecting the sky to turn that bruised purple again." "It won't," she said, moving closer until she was standing just behind him. The tactile friction of her proximity made him stiffen, but he didn't pull away. "The port key didn't just move us, Draco. It severed the tether, the magic you used. It burned out the tracking charms. To them, we are ash on a cliffside." He finally turned his head, his grey eyes searching hers. The storm in them had subsided, leaving behind a vast, empty sea of internal guilt. "My mother," he started, his voice cracking. "I sent a message through the goblin channels this morning," she interrupted gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. His skin was warm now, the fever of the curse replaced by the healthy heat of a living man. "She's safe. She's in Denmark, just as you planned. She thinks you're dead, Draco. For now, that is her greatest protection." Draco let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned his head back against her hip. It was a gesture of emotional vulnerability that would have been unthinkable a month ago. He was the morally grey boy who had been broken on the wheel of his own heritage, and she was the principled girl who had found the beauty in the wreckage. "I don't know how to be this," he whispered into the fabric of her skirt. "I don't know how to be a man who isn't a weapon or a trophy." "You start by breathing," she said, her fingers finding their way into the silver silk of his hair. "And then you start by looking at what you've saved instead of what you've lost." The warmth between them was no longer a flicker. It was a steady flame. But as the sun began to set, casting long violet shadows across the vineyard, the doubt crept back into the corners of the terrace. That evening, they sat in the small stone-walled kitchen. A single candle burned between them, the flame dancing in the light breeze. Hermione was reading an old French text on medicinal herbs, but her mind was on the man across from her. Draco was cleaning a small silver dagger, a habit of his, she realized, a way to keep his hands from shaking. "Why me?" he asked suddenly, not looking up from the blade. "Why did I stay?" she clarified. "Why did you look for the human in me?" he said, finally looking up. The candlelight made his eyes look like molten silver. "I called you names. I watched you suffer. I stood by while my family tried to destroy yours. Why was I worth the risk of a cliffside?" The tension in the room thickened. This was the conversation they had been avoiding, the broken prejudices that still lay between them like jagged glass. "Because you bought me," she said, her voice steady. Draco flinched as if she had struck him. "Don't say that." "No, listen to me," she insisted, standing up and walking around the table. She took the dagger from his hand and set it down, then took both of his hands in hers. "You bought me to give me a chance. You didn't buy a slave. You bought time. You spent every ounce of your privilege, your gold and your safety to build a wall around me. I didn't stay because I felt I owed you a debt, Draco. I stayed because I saw a man who was willing to die for a mudblood he was supposed to hate. And I realized that if you could change that much in the dark, then there was still hope for the world." She squeezed his hands, her thumbs tracing the lines of his palms. You are not your father. You are not your mark. You are the boy who hid Luna's book and the man who held me in the library when the world was ending. The approach was inevitable. Draco stood up, his height once again imposing, but there was no malice in it now. He looked down at her, his expression a mixture of awe and a terrifying soul-deep longing. "You are so remarkably intelligent," he breathed, his hand coming up to cup her jaw. The bite of his silver ring was gone, but the memory of it remained, a reminder of where they had come from. "And you are so remarkably wrong about me. I'm not a hero, Hermione. I'm just a man who couldn't stand the thought of a world without your fire in it." He leaned in, his lips hovering just inches from hers. The non-verbal intimacy was suffocating, a magnetic pull that made her heart race. But just as she prepared for the kiss, he pulled back, a flash of betrayal in his own mind. "I have nothing to give you," he rasped. "No name, no gold, no wand, just a scarred arm and a lifetime of nightmares." "Then give me the nightmares," she whispered, reaching up to pull him back to her. "I've had enough of my own. We can share them." The final shift was happening. The repulsion was gone, burned away by the simple, radical act of acceptance. Draco let out a jagged sound, half sob and half laugh, and crushed his mouth to hers. This kiss was different from the one on the cliffside. It wasn't about blood or iron or the taste of death. It was about the warmth of the sun, the scent of lavender, and the slow, agonizing realization that they were free to feel. He tasted of wine and salt and 1,000 unspoken apologies. Hermione wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them, no room for doubt or fear. They stood there in the quiet kitchen, two broken things fitting together to make something whole. The internal monologue of Hermione's mind finally went quiet, replaced by the simple, steady thrum of his heart against hers. But even as the warmth flooded her, a cold thought flickered in the back of her mind. They were safe here, but for how long? The Dark Lord would not stop. The world was still burning. And as much as she wanted to stay in this valley forever, she knew that the conflict wasn't over. It had just changed shape. "We can't stay here forever," she whispered into his neck. Draco pulled back, his eyes dark and serious. "I know. We have to find the others. We have to finish it." Draco looked at his scarred arm, then back at her. The morally grey boy was gone. In his place was a man who had found something worth fighting for, not out of duty, but out of love. "Then we finish it," he said, his voice hard and determined. "But not tonight." He picked her up, her legs wrapping around his waist instinctively, and carried her out of the kitchen toward the small bedroom that smelled of dried herbs and moonlight. The tension had transformed into a slow-burn heat that promised a different kind of survival. As the candle in the kitchen flickered and died, leaving the house in a soft velvet darkness, Hermione knew that the seesaw would swing again. There would be more warmth and more cold, more trust and more betrayal as they re-entered the war. But as she lay in his arms, watching the moon climb over the French hills, she knew that the most important shift had already occurred. They were no longer bought at an auction. They were no longer Lot 17 and the Lord of the Manor. They were simply Hermione and Draco. And in a world of shadows, that was the most powerful magic of all. The night was long, filled with the tactile friction of discovery and the non-verbal intimacy of two souls finally finding their home. There was no modern vocabulary to describe the way they clung to each other, only the ancient language of touch and the silence that spoke of 1,000 promises. As the first light of dawn began to touch the vineyards, Draco leaned over her, his silver-blonde hair shielding her face from the sun. He kissed her forehead, then her nose, and finally her lips, a series of one or more kisses that felt like a benediction. "Happy," he whispered. "No," she said, pulling him down to her. "I'm hopeful, and for now, that's better." The seventh part of their story ended, not with a resolution, but with a beginning. The external plot waited for them beyond the valley, but for one more hour they were the only two people in the universe. And as the atmospheric pressure of the coming war prepared to test them again, they held on to each other, the magnetic pull of their love, the only thing keeping them from drifting away into the dark. The return to Britain was not a grand homecoming, but a tactical infiltration. The atmospheric pressure changed the moment they crossed the channel, the air growing heavy with the familiar metallic tang of the Dark Lord's reign. But this time, they weren't alone. They had spent weeks in France, coordinating with the remnants of the resistance, using the Malfoy family's hidden channels to funnel information and resources. Draco had changed. The internal guilt was still there, but it was tempered by a new, sharp-edged resolve. He was the ghost in the machine, the man who knew the weaknesses of the Ministry because he had helped build its foundations. And Hermione was the strategist, the mind that could weave his insights into a plan that actually had a chance of success. The final confrontation didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened in the very place where it all began, the Ministry atrium. Under the cover of a massive distraction, Hermione and Draco moved through the shadows of the underground halls. The non-verbal intimacy of their teamwork was flawless. A look, a touch, a shared breath was all they needed to move in sync. They reached the auction block, the spot where Hermione had been sold like a piece of property. It was empty now, the crystal chandeliers dimmed, the air smelling of stale wine and old fear. "I hated you so much on that day," she whispered, her hand finding his in the dark. "I hated myself more," Draco replied, his grip on her hand firm. "But I'm glad I bought you, Hermione. It was the only honest thing I've ever done with my father's gold." The final shift of the war was a chaotic blur of light and sound. The Dark Lord fell not because of a single hero, but because the system he had built, the system of master and slave, had been rotted from the inside by those who chose to see the humanity in their enemies. When the dust finally settled and the bruised purple sky of London began to clear into a natural pale blue, Hermione stood on the steps of the Ministry. The cold of the war was finally breaking. Draco was beside her, his face streaked with soot, his white shirt torn. He looked at the crowd, expecting them to turn on him, to see only the Death Eater. But Hermione didn't let go of his hand. She stepped forward, pulling him with her into the light. "It's over," she said, her voice carrying across the quieted atrium. Draco pulled her toward him, ignoring the eyes of the world. He cupped her face in his hands, hands that were now shaking with an overwhelming emotion. "I love you," he whispered, the words finally breaking through the last of his internal walls. Hermione didn't answer with words. She pulled him down and kissed him. It was a long, slow kiss that tasted of victory, of peace, and of the long, difficult road they had travelled. It was a promise that the tension between them would now be used to build a world, not survive it. Months later, the south of France felt like a different universe. The estate was warm, sun-drenched, and quiet. Narcissa was there, a silent shadow of her former self, but safe. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the vineyards in shades of amethyst, Hermione and Draco walked down to the low stone wall. The air was soft, carrying the scent of wild thyme. Draco dropped to one knee on the soft grass, not out of a script, but out of a visceral need. "I used to think power was about what you could command," he whispered, taking her hands. "But I was wrong. Power is having the strength to let go of the dark. Hermione Granger, will you stay with me? Not because I bought you, but because I don't know how to breathe without your fire." Hermione felt the warmth flood her. "Always," she breathed. She pulled him up and brought his mouth to hers. This kiss was the final resolution, sensual, deep, and emotional. It was the visceral alignment of two lives that had finally found their purpose. Draco's hands were firm on her waist, pulling her flush against him, his touch desperate and hungry for the future. He pulled back, his breath hitching, and kissed her again, a soft, lingering press of lips that felt like a sacred vow. Then another on her forehead and another on the tip of her nose. "I love you, Draco," she said, a beautiful truth in the cooling air. "And I love you," he replied. The Golden Girl and the Malfoy heir were gone, replaced by two people who had found the courage to be vulnerable. The story of Lot 17 did not end with the transaction. It ended with a choice. As they walked back toward the house, the light from the windows spilling gold onto the terrace, Hermione knew the fluctuations of life would continue. But the foundation was no longer rot. They were free. They were together. And in the soft, magical glow of their shared home, the story finally found its happy ending. A quiet, beautiful truth written in the stars. 2 years had passed since the fall of the Ministry, yet time in the Valley of Provence seemed to move by its own ancient clock. The air here did not taste of ozone or ash. It tasted of sun-drenched rosemary, ripening grapes, and the clean, cold water of the mountain springs. For Hermione, the transition from the frantic, can't help but think of the war to the quiet being of peace had been a slow, sometimes agonizing process. The silence of the manor had once been a threat, but the silence of the vineyard was a gift, a blank page upon which she and Draco were writing a new, fragile history. On this particular evening, the sky was a bruised plum, fading into a soft, dusty rose at the horizon. Hermione stood on the terrace of their stone house, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the grain of a weathered wooden table. She was no longer wearing the heavy green velvet of the Malfoys or the rough grey rags of a prisoner. She wore a simple dress of cream-coloured linen, the fabric light and honest against her skin. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. Draco's gait had changed. The sharp, arrogant click of dragon-hide boots had been replaced by the soft, rhythmic step of a man who no longer felt the need to command the floor beneath him. He stepped out from the shadows of the doorway, a bottle of dark red wine in one hand and 2 crystal glasses in the other. The atmospheric pressure between them had reached a state of perfect habitual grace. The tactile friction was no longer a spark of fear, but a magnetic pull of comfort. Draco set the glasses down and pulled her back against his chest. His hands, once cold and shaking with the weight of a silver signet ring, were now warm and steady as they crossed over her stomach. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath a soft, familiar heat against her neck. "You're thinking again, Granger," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that she felt in her marrow. "I can hear the gears turning from the kitchen." "I was just thinking about the library," she replied, leaning her head back against his collarbone. "About how I used to count the seconds between your visits. I used to think the clock was mocking me." Draco's grip tightened slightly, not with the bruising force of the past, but with a protective, grounding pressure. The internal guilt he carried was like a scar. It didn't hurt every day, but it was a permanent part of his geography. "I spent those seconds trying to convince myself I didn't care if you were breathing or not," Draco admitted, his voice dropping to a raw, honest register. "Every time I walked through those doors, I had to build a wall of ice just to keep from falling at your feet and begging for your forgiveness. The repulsion was the only thing keeping us both alive." Hermione turned in his arms, her hands sliding up his chest to rest at the nape of his neck. The silver blonde hair was longer now, softer, no longer slicked back into a mask of aristocratic indifference. She looked into his eyes. The grey was clear, like a lake after a storm, reflecting the fading light of the sun. "We aren't those people anymore, Draco," she said, her thumb tracing the faint, jagged line on his jaw. "The auction is over. The price was paid." "I know," he breathed, his eyes searching hers with a desperate, lingering intensity. "But sometimes, when the wind catches the drapes just right, I expect to see a guard at the door. I expect to see you in that grey tunic, looking at me as if I were the devil himself." The non-verbal intimacy of the moment was profound. He didn't need to say he was sorry. He had spent 700 days saying it with his hands, his eyes, and his presence. He pulled her closer, his lips brushing her forehead, then the bridge of her nose, and finally lingering on the corner of her mouth. The slow burn of their romance had evolved into a steady, deep-seated warmth. The emotional seesaw had finally found its level. They had moved beyond the trust and betrayal cycle into a territory of absolute, terrifying vulnerability. "Come," he said, taking her hand. "The table is set. Narcissa is in town with the healers, so it's just us tonight." They sat at the small table, the candlelight casting long, flickering shadows against the stone walls. The meal was simple: bread, cheese, and the dark, bitter wine of the valley. As they ate, they talked not of the war or the trials that were still ongoing in London, but of the mundane, beautiful things. The new batch of lavender, the leaky roof in the east stable, the letter from Neville about the rebuilding of the Hogwarts greenhouses. "He wants us to visit," Hermione said, swirling the wine in her glass, "for the opening of the memorial garden." Draco froze, his fork hovering over his plate. The internal conflict flickered in his eyes. The boy who had been a villain and the man who was a ghost. "They won't want me there, Hermione. I'm a reminder of the darkness they're trying to forget." "You're a reminder that people can change," she countered, her voice firm with that old Gryffindor fire. "You're a reminder that the world isn't divided into good and Death Eaters. You're the reason I'm here. You're the reason the Resistance had the keys to the vaults." She reached across the table, her fingers interlacing with his. The magnetic pull between them was a physical force, a bridge over the abyss of his shame. "I won't go without you," she added, her gaze unwavering. "I won't stand in a garden of peace if the man who gave me my life isn't standing beside me." Draco looked down at their joined hands. The tactile friction of her skin against his seemed to anchor him to the present, pulling him out of the shadows of Malfoy Manor. He let out a long, ragged sigh and looked up, a sad, beautiful smile touching his lips. "You've always been the bravest of us, Granger," he whispered. "I suppose, if you're there, I can face a few ghosts." After dinner, the darkness settled completely over the valley, a velvet blanket studded with 1,000,000 indifferent stars. They walked down to the edge of the vineyard, where the air was cool and smelled of damp earth. The atmospheric pressure was heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. Draco stopped by a large, flat rock that overlooked the valley floor. He pulled a small silver object from his pocket. It wasn't the silver bird that had saved them, nor was it a signet ring of the Black or Malfoy line. It was a simple, delicate band of white gold, etched with the pattern of a vine, a symbol of the life they had built in the dirt of France. "I didn't buy this with gold from the vaults," he said, his voice trembling slightly. The emotional vulnerability was a raw, visceral thing between them. "I worked the harvest for the neighbors. I earned this with my own hands. No blood, no heritage, just me." He took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "I know I once bought your life at an auction. It was the most shameful and the most lucky moment of my existence. But tonight, I'm asking if you'll give it to me freely. Not as a prize, not as a prisoner, but as my wife." Hermione felt the breath leave her lungs. The final shift was no longer a possibility. It was a reality. The golden girl who had been declawed and caged was now a woman who held the heart of her captor in her hands, and she knew exactly how to keep it safe. "Yes," she whispered, the word a soft, definitive snap in the quiet of the night. 1,000 times, yes. Draco slid the ring onto her finger. It felt light, yet it carried the weight of everything they had survived. He pulled her into his arms, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was no longer desperate or salty with blood. This kiss was slow, deep, and tasted of the future. It was the final resolution of a story that had begun in a dungeon and ended in a garden. He lifted her, her legs wrapping around his waist, just as they had on the day they escaped, and he carried her back toward the house. The non-verbal intimacy of their movement was a dance they had practiced in the dark for 2 years. Inside the bedroom, the moonlight spilled across the white linens like liquid silver. The tactile friction of skin on skin, of breath on breath, was the only magic they needed. There were no more emotional seesaws, no more warmth and cold. There was only the steady, burning heat of 2 people who had found the light in each other's shadows. As the early hours of the morning approached, Hermione lay in the curve of his arm, her head on his chest. She listened to the steady, rhythmic thud of his heart, the heart that had almost stopped for her, the heart that now beat only for her. She looked at the ring on her finger, the white gold shimmering in the dark. The internal monologue of her life was no longer a scream of defiance or a whisper of fear. It was a quiet song of belonging. "Draco," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "We're free." He tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer into the warmth of his body. We've been free since the library, Hermione. We just finally stopped running. The silence of the French valley was absolute, a hollow echo of the peace they had earned. The external plot of the world would continue. There would be trials and rebuilding and the slow healing of a broken nation. But here, in the soft glow of the moon, the story of Lot 17 was over. They were no longer defined by the war, or the auction, or the blood in their veins. They were defined by the choice they made every morning to stay, to love, and to remember. As the first light of dawn touched the tips of the grapevines, Hermione Granger closed her eyes, a small, triumphant smile on her lips. She had been bought at an auction, yes, but in the end, she was the one who had won the greatest prize of all, the soul of the man who had tried to save her, and a love that would never again be for sale. The happy ending was not a destination, she realized. It was the quiet, steady rhythm of two hearts beating as one, in a world that was finally, truly theirs.
Thank you for listening to this story. I wanted to show you a different side of Draco and Hermione. They live in a dark world, a world with no hope, but even in the dark they found each other. Draco was broken inside. He carried a lot of guilt. Hermione was strong, but she was lonely. They were enemies, but they became each other home. This story is about more than magic. It is about choice. It is about looking past hate. It shows that love can be a shield. It shows that even a monster can choose to be a hero. I hope you felt the rain at the manor. I hope you felt the wind on the cliffs. And most of all, I hope you felt their love. Sometimes the person we hate is the only one who can save us. Love is the most powerful magic of all. Thank you for being here with me. Until next time.